October 14th, 1944. A cold dawn mist clung to the rolling farmland outside Bastogne, turning the Belgian fields into a pale, shivering blur of frost-tipped rose. In the centre of those fields stood an old grain silo, 40 feet of concrete, weather-stained, streaked with rust from the iron ladder that clung to its side like a spine. To most, it was nothing more than a farmer's storehouse. To Jakob Vermeer, a broad-shouldered 43-year-old dairy farmer whose boots had walked those acres since childhood, it had become something else entirely. It had become the one place where he felt he could still protect what little remained of his world. German officers had moved into the area 2 days earlier. Elite planners, map readers, dispatch runners, the men who directed the armoured thrusts that were choking the countryside. Their field headquarters was now set up in the old parish hall, just beyond Jakob's northern fence line, a stone building surrounded by staff cars, motorcycles, and a steady flow of boots going in and out. The Germans felt safe here. It was quiet, rural, unlikely to draw shells or aircraft. But Jakob watched the way they strutted between the vehicles, how lightly they carried themselves, how they smoked and joked in the yard, like men convinced the war was tilting back in their favour. He saw them from the top of the silo the night they arrived. The climb had chilled him, the metal rungs biting cold through his gloves. But the moment he reached the viewing hatch, he froze, not from the cold, but from what he saw. The officers were not merely bivouacked. They had requisitioned nearby farms, pushed families out, shot livestock for convenience, and set up a command pipeline that would feed the next push deeper toward the Allied lines. Jakob's farm, the one he had inherited from his father, the one where he had buried his wife 3 years earlier, would be next. He returned to his kitchen table that night, lantern flickering, jaw clenched. His hands trembled as he unwrapped the rifle he had kept hidden under the floorboards since the Germans first occupied Belgium in 1940. It was his father's old Mauser hunting rifle, the wood worn smooth by decades of hands, the barrel still oiled, the scope clear despite its age. Jakob had used it for deer, for wolves, for foxes, but never for men. He stared at it for a long time, listening to the distant rumble of armour and the sharper crack of a single pistol shot somewhere beyond the hedgerows. That sound made the decision for him. By morning, he was back inside the silo, breath steaming in the cold interior. He had brought sacks of grain up the ladder to build himself a hidden nest, tight, cramped, dusty, but with a narrow, perfect view of the parish hall yard. Through the old metal slit near the top, the world below appeared as if framed deliberately for him. A courtyard, parked vehicles, a long gravel path where officers routinely emerged to check maps, smoke cigarettes, or shout orders. He waited. He let the frost melt into day. At 09:12, the first officer stepped out, a captain with a clipboard tucked under his arm, barking something at a pair of dispatch riders. Jakob steadied the rifle against a grain sack, letting the barrel drift until the scope crosshairs found the man's chest. His heartbeat thudded painfully. He exhaled, then exhaled again. This was no deer. This was a man with a mother, perhaps with children, with a career. But this was also a man who had dragged Jakob's neighbours into the mud and forced them at gunpoint to kneel behind their barns. Jakob squeezed the trigger. The crack echoed inside the silo, louder than he expected, bouncing off the cylindrical walls like a thunderclap. Outside, the officer dropped instantly. No stagger, no cry, just a sudden collapse that made the dispatch riders freeze. Jakob chambered another round, staying calm, watching the yard erupt into confusion as boots thundered from the hall. Confusion was good. Confusion meant delay. Delay meant advantage. Another officer sprinted out, shouting for cover, waving toward the tree line as if the shot had come from the east. Jakob let him come into the open. Let him reach the exact middle of the yard, where the frost had melted into thin, reflective mud. Then another shot, another echo, another man falling without warning. The Germans panicked, pointing rifles at wrong angles, dropping behind vehicles, shouting overlapping orders that only made the chaos worse. Jakob kept still, hidden in his grain nest, letting his breathing settle. The silo's height gave him invisibility. Its slit windows made the muzzle flash invisible from outside, and the Germans simply couldn't imagine a lone farmer had turned his own grain tower into a sniper's loft. For the first time in 4 years of occupation, Jakob felt the power shift, not entirely, not enough to end the war, but enough to remind him that the land wasn't only a place to grow wheat and corn. It could be a fortress when a man had nothing left but courage, desperation, and a clear line of sight. The third officer appeared just after noon, crouched low, clutching field glasses as he scanned the ridgelines. He moved cautiously, but he made the mistake all the others had. He never once looked at the silo, treating it as nothing more than a farmer's storage tank. Jakob steadied the rifle and waited for the moment the officer leaned slightly forward, exposing the center of his back. Another shot, another fall. Jakob closed his eyes and whispered a quiet apology he knew would never be heard. But he also thought of his wife, of the farm she loved, of the promise he made to protect this land until the war ended, or until he did. Every man in that courtyard was helping push the German line forward toward American and British units that were barely holding. If he could slow them, if he could kneecap this nerve center, he might save not just his own fields, but countless Allied soldiers fighting only miles away. By sundown, he had taken 5 shots. 5 German officers lay in the yard. Patrols swept the wrong hills, vehicles repositioned to shield the hall, but still, none of them looked up at the tall, silent silo. Jakob sat in the dimness of his tiny nest, rifle across his knees, watching lanterns flicker below as panic thickened across the headquarters. He knew this was only the beginning. Night would bring movement, morning would bring more officers, and the silo, unmoving, unremarkable, overlooked, would remain his battlefield. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and waited for the next day, unaware that his improvised sniper nest would soon become legend, the place where a single farmer stopped an entire German command chain and would ultimately kill 28 of their officers before the front collapsed inward and swallowed the parish hall whole. The night settled over the farmland like a heavy wool blanket, muffling sound, turning every fence post and distant barn into a vague silhouette against the dim blue haze. Jakob remained inside the silo, legs stiff, eyes gritty, the dust of grain clinging to his coat and hair. His tiny sniper nest smelled of old wheat, metal, and cold stone, sharp, dry, grounding. Below him, the Germans had set up flood lamps in the courtyard, casting long shadows that jittered across walls and cobblestones as soldiers moved nervously from one position to the next. Officers barked hushed orders, their voices thinner now, stripped of the confidence they'd strutted in with the day before. They still believed the shooter was in the tree line. Their searchlights roamed the woods. Patrols marched outward in widening arcs. Machine gunners fixed themselves behind sandbags facing the hedgerows, and all the while Jakob watched unnoticed from above, the height of the silo turning his world into a series of perfect angles. Just before midnight, a staff car arrived, sleek, black, the kind reserved for senior command. The moment the engine cut, tension rippled through the courtyard. Jakob pressed his eye to the scope and studied the officer who stepped out. Even from the height, he could see the man carried himself like someone used to giving orders others feared to question. The shoulders set back, the cap brim low, the leather gloves spotless. He walked straight into the parish hall without a glance toward the search perimeter. Jakob knew what that meant. Reinforcement of authority, reorganization, perhaps counter-sniping measures. If the Germans stopped panicking and started thinking, the silo would cease to be invisible. He considered taking the shot right then, ending the man before he stepped fully through the doorway. But the courtyard was too crowded, the lighting unpredictable. The staff car doors were still open. A miss could expose his nest. So he waited, chewing the inside of his cheek, pulse in his throat like a hammer. When dawn broke, the world outside was pale and rimmed with frost again. Jakob's breath fogged in front of him as he checked the rifle, retightened the cloth around the barrel to muffle its sound, and slid another row of cartridges into reach. Below, the Germans moved with a different rhythm, faster, sharper, more coordinated. The senior officer had not slept. Jakob could tell by the way men clustered around him in tight circles, listening to instructions, pointing at maps spread on the hood of a Kubelwagen. A counterstrike was being planned, aimed at the Allied regiments south of the river. Those regiments were already exhausted. If this headquarters succeeded in recalibrating the German line, Jakob knew American casualties would surge by the thousands. At 07:41, the first officer stepped into the open to relay orders to a motorcycle courier. Jakob's finger settled on the trigger in a motion that now felt frighteningly natural. He squeezed. The shot cracked. The man fell backward into the mud, his cap tumbling off and rolling toward a jeep. Shouts burst from the courtyard. Soldiers ducked. The courier dropped his satchel and scrambled behind a stone trough. Jakob struck again before they could regroup, this time targeting the lieutenant, sprinting toward the rear entrance. The round caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him sideways into the wooden wall. Another officer rushed to drag him inside, and Jakob nearly fired again, but held his breath instead, waiting, watching patterns. The Germans now fanned out not toward the tree line, but toward the village street, rifles raised. A small group advanced cautiously toward the silo, but only to search the barn beside it. They didn't look up once. Two even leaned their rifles against the base to light cigarettes before rejoining the patrol. The absurdity of it tightened Jakob's chest. His heart beat so loudly he worried it might echo down the ladder. He forced himself to stay still, to think like a man who hunted foxes rather than fought soldiers. Movement kills. Patience wins. He breathed shallowly, counting the seconds until the patrol drifted away and the courtyard swelled again with officers emerging to recompose their shattered communications. One of them, tall, thin, wearing a long grey coat, held a field radio handset and paced back and forth with agitated bursts of speech. Jakob steadied the rifle and waited for him to pause. When the officer stopped at the edge of the light and lifted the handset closer to his mouth, Jakob fired. The round hit so cleanly that the man collapsed straight downward, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The radio clattered beside him. Another wave of chaos followed. Jakob exhaled slowly, wiped sweat from his brow despite the cold, and reached for another cartridge. His hands shook now, not from fear, but from the toll. He had killed more men in 20 hours than he had ever imagined possible. Men who would have destroyed Allied lines. Men who would have burned farms and villages and dragged families into the mud. But still, men. He steadied himself, whispered again to the memory of his wife, and sighted another target. By mid-morning, the headquarters was coming apart at the seams. Officers ventured outside only in short bursts, dashing between vehicles, waving messages, shouting contradictory orders. Jakob struck them when he could, always from the shadows of his narrow slit window, never firing twice in too quick a rhythm, always shifting his posture within the grain sacks to avoid creating a predictable firing spot. But the senior officer, the one from the black staff car, remained elusive. He stayed inside the parish hall, shielded behind stone walls and layers of terrified runners. Jakob tried to anticipate when the man would emerge. He watched the windows, he studied shadows, he counted the intervals of staff entering and exiting, and slowly he realized the senior officer was preparing for something bigger, something urgent. Around noon, trucks began pulling into the courtyard, 3, then 5, then 7. Jakob tensed. Supplies, communications equipment, reinforcements, or perhaps worse, mobile artillery observers. If those trucks succeeded in re-establishing reliable command flow, the German front would surge again. He needed to disrupt it. Jakob scanned the tarpaulin-covered load of the nearest truck until he spotted an officer with a clipboard standing atop the bumper, shouting instructions. It was a perfect silhouette. Jakob fired. The man pitched backward off the truck, landing hard on the cobblestones. Soldiers scrambled, shouting in all directions. 2 more officers rushed forward to take his place. Jakob fired again. One fell immediately. The other dropped to a knee, rifle raised at the tree line again. They still had not even considered the silo. Jakob leaned back from the slit, chest burning from the tension. He had killed 14 officers by now, perhaps more if the wounded ones succumbed. The courtyard looked like a hive in collapse. Dead men covered with blankets, vehicles abandoned mid-turn, maps scattered in the mud. But the command still functioned, wobbling yet alive, and the senior officer still had not come out. Jakob waited. Minutes passed. The winter light thinned. A new staff car arrived. Then a motorcycle messenger. Then another. At last, as the sun dipped toward the barns on the western horizon, the door opened again. The senior officer stepped out, fury drawn tight across his face, his gloves pulled on with sharp motions. He was preparing to address the surviving officers, to restore order, perhaps to announce a counter-sniper team had been requested. Jakob steadied his rifle. His breath trembled. His finger found the trigger, but something blocked the shot. 2 junior officers stood on either side of him. Jakob waited, eyes burning, muscles rigid. The senior officer gestured for them to move closer as he began explaining something over a map held open between them. 3 heads. 1 target Jakob needed, but he could not fire blindly. A miss meant everything was over. He waited. Seconds dragged like minutes. Then 1 officer turned away, stepping toward the truck line. The other bent to pick up something dropped near his boot. And for a fraction of a second, the senior officer stood alone in a narrow beam of golden evening light. Jakob fired. The round struck the man in the sternum. The officer staggered back, arms flinching wide, the map fluttering out of his hands like a wounded bird. Shouts erupted. Soldiers dragged him inside, but Jakob could tell from the collapse of his shoulders that the man was already gone. Silence washed briefly over the courtyard. Jakob lowered the rifle and closed his eyes. But the fight was not over. Killing the senior officer would create chaos, yet chaos was unpredictable. Desperate men made desperate decisions, and night was coming again. He knew tomorrow would be bloodier than today. He also knew the Germans would finally understand something they had missed for nearly 30 hours. The shooter wasn't in the trees. He was above them. Inside the very silo they walked past every day. The realization, when it came, would be explosive, and Jakob would have to survive it. The second night inside the silo felt different. Not tense, not cold, but heavy in a way Jakob had never experienced in all his life as a farmer. The grain sacks around him, once familiar, now felt like walls closing in. His knees ached. His back throbbed from hunching over the rifle for hours. The lantern he kept shielded behind a crate flickered with a weak, sputtering glow, barely enough to illuminate the cartridges lined neatly in a row beside him. Below, the Germans were no longer merely nervous. They were frightened, truly frightened. Lanterns dotted the courtyard in frantic clusters, voices collided in overlapping panicked shouts, and officers who once strutted now moved in jerks and half-crouches like hunted animals. The death of their senior commander had broken something in them, something deeper than discipline. It had ruptured the illusion of safety. Jakob knew they would adjust soon. Fear sparks thinking. Thinking leads to deduction. Deduction leads to the truth he had been praying they wouldn't reach. The shot angles weren't coming from the trees. The shot echoes weren't coming from the hills. They were coming from above. He couldn't see their reactions, but he imagined it. An officer staring at a map of the courtyard, with pins marking the fallen. Another pointing to trajectory estimates scribbled hastily on scrap paper, the realization dawning in their eyes. And then someone would step outside and look at the silo. The thought tightened Jakob's throat. Around midnight, the courtyard fell quiet. Eerily so. No footsteps, no shouted orders, no engines. Just the wind pushing softly against the metal ladder outside, and the quiet hum of winter air slipping through the cracks of the old concrete cylinder. Jakob tightened his grip on the rifle. They were planning something. He waited, barely breathing, ears tuned to every sound. The night stretched long, slow, fragile. At one point, he imagined he heard a whisper at the silo's base, Boots scraping lightly on stone, a hushed command, someone testing the metal rung of the ladder. He leaned forward, heart pounding, listening. Silence. But silence was worse. Silence meant they were either gone or they were waiting. Sometime before dawn, Jakob finally drifted into a thin, uneasy sleep. A sound woke him, soft, rhythmic, metallic. Not footsteps, not gunfire, tapping. He froze, breath held tight. The tapping grew louder, sharper, more deliberate. Then came the unmistakable grind of metal on metal. They had found the ladder. Jakob crawled to the viewing slit and pressed his cheek to the cold concrete. He angled down through the narrow opening until he saw them. 4 German soldiers, their helmets dark shapes in the morning twilight, 2 holding rifles pointed skyward. The other 2 climbing the ladder slowly, methodically, rungs creaking under their boots. His pulse thudded at his temples. He had always known this moment would come, but not this soon, not before sunrise, not while the frost still clung to the fields like a silver film. He reached for the rifle, then held himself back. Firing at the ladder would expose the muzzle flash. Worse, it might ricochet and reveal his exact firing slit. He needed time. He needed distance. He needed the soldiers to come closer, inside the narrow upper ring where the silo's shape worked in his favour. Only then could he fight. Jakob crawled back into the shadows, positioning himself near the hatch where the ladder entered the top chamber. He steadied his breathing. He felt the weight of the Mauser in his hands. A familiar weight. A trusted weight. And listened as the climbing soldiers drew nearer. A boot struck the metal above the last rung. A helmet bobbed into view through the hatch. Jakob whispered an apology he no longer had the strength to hide and swung the butt of his rifle hard into the man's face. The soldier collapsed instantly, slipping from the ladder and falling backward into the darkness below. The thud of his landing echoed across the courtyard. Shouts erupted. The second climber hesitated, but only for a moment. His helmet rose into view. Jakob grabbed a grain sack and flung it downward. The sack struck the soldier's shoulder, knocking him sideways. He lost his grip and fell, screaming all the way down until the scream broke suddenly upon hitting the ground. The courtyard exploded into chaos. Rifle fire cracked upward. Bullets smacked into the silo walls. Concrete dust rained into Jakob's hair. He ducked back into his sniper nest, coughing, squinting through the swirl of dust, waiting for the next assault. It didn't come. Instead, an officer shouted something guttural, commanding, frustrated. Jakob crawled back to the slit. Below, the Germans were dragging the fallen men away, regrouping near the trucks. Several pointed at the silo now. Not the barn, not the tree line, but the silo. One soldier traced the trajectory of scattered bullet impacts upward with the tip of his rifle, following it carefully until he reached the viewing slit. Jakob's stomach dropped. They knew. One officer slapped the side of a truck, shouting orders to crank the engine. Another sprinted toward a cart carrying mortar tubes. Jakob tensed. Mortars would collapse the silo. They weren't accurate, but at this distance, accuracy wouldn't matter. A single lucky hit would shatter his nest and pin him inside with rubble. He scanned the courtyard. Officers were stepping into the open now, coordinating, pointing, directing. If he let them organize the mortar team, this was over. Jakob gritted his teeth, steadied his rifle, and did what he had done since dawn the previous day. He targeted the men giving orders. The first mortar officer dropped instantly. Chaos ripped through the gathering. Men scattered. Others crouched, shouting at the mortar crew to take cover. Another officer ran forward to take charge. Jakob shot him too. The courtyard fell apart again, discipline fracturing like snapped timber. One man panicked and fired a machine gun directly at the silo's midsection. Jakob ducked as a spray of concrete chips erupted inside the chamber, leaving his ears ringing. More bullets followed, but the angle was wrong. Most rounds deflected or lodged harmlessly into the thick curved wall. He waited for a gap, found one. Shot another officer standing near the communications cart. He watched the man crumple, his hand still clutching a radio handset. The Germans abandoned the mortar attempt. They switched instead to something Jakob had feared from the beginning: fire. Men rushed to the base of the silo carrying buckets of gasoline, sloshing it around the foundation, soaking the ground, the metal ladder, the lower ventilation slits. Jakob's throat tightened. Fire would smoke him out. Smoke would blind him. Blindness meant death. He scrambled down from his nest to the opposite side of the chamber, coughing from dust and fear. Below, he could see faint flickers of orange through the lower gaps. Flames licked upward, catching on the wooden platform beneath him. Heat began to rise, slow but steady, pressing into his lungs like a warning. If he stayed, he would die inside a burning tower. If he climbed down, they would gun him down the moment his boots touched the ground. He pressed his forehead to the cold concrete, thinking. And then he remembered something. Something old, something mundane. The grain chute. A narrow vertical shaft on the far side of the silo, used for releasing grain into wagons. It emptied into a small gap behind the stone trough near the courtyard wall. Jakob had shoveled grain through it hundreds of times with his father. The exit was low, tight, partly obscured by a plank. But it was never locked. He crawled toward it, choking as smoke thickened. The wooden floor began to groan beneath him, heated from below. Flames crackled louder now, hungrily devouring the ladder Jakob had climbed only a day earlier. He found the chute hatch, pulled it open, and felt a blast of cool night air on his face. The shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for his shoulders. But he shoved the rifle in first, then squeezed in after it, inching downward, scraping his elbows, dragging himself through darkness. Grain dust filled his nostrils. His boots slid against smooth metal. Heat from above chased him downward. The chute ended abruptly, dropping him into a shallow hollow behind the trough. Jakob landed hard on his side, but didn't make a sound. In front of him, just meters away, German soldiers rushed back and forth, some screaming orders, others directing hoses of gasoline, still trying desperately to ignite the silo fully. Smoke billowed upward, flames surged. Jakob pressed himself flat against the mud, invisible beneath the trough's shadow. He could run. He could crawl into the corn rows and disappear. He could vanish forever into the countryside and hope the Allies arrived before the Germans torched every farm in their path. But then he heard shouting near the trucks, urgent, panicked shouting. Officers, several of them, rounding up maps, radios, dispatch cases. They were preparing to move the headquarters, to re-establish command elsewhere, to resume directing the front. If they escaped now, the next Allied push would walk into a killing box. Jakob lifted his head from the mud. He wiped blood from his cheek. He gripped the rifle. He had one chance left. Moving low, silent, steady as winter water, he crawled along the base of the stone wall until he reached a broken section of fence overlooking the courtyard. Through it, he saw a cluster of officers rushing toward the remaining vehicles. 8, 9, maybe more. He braced the rifle against the post. He exhaled. And he fired. Chaos erupted once again. Officers dove for cover, some shouting desperately, others collapsing into the mud before they reached the trucks. Jakob fired again and again, picking off the ones shouting instructions, the ones waving others forward, the ones who still believed they could salvage command. By the time his final cartridge clicked empty, the courtyard had fallen still. Some soldiers fled across the fields, scattering into the frost. Others surrendered immediately when they saw Jakob stand from the shadows, rifle lowered, face blackened with soot and determination. The fire at the silo sputtered weakly now, no longer fed, no longer central to their thoughts. Their command was shattered. Their officers were dead. Jakob, one farmer with one rifle, had killed 28 German officers in less than 2 days. When the American infantry arrived that evening, pushing through the battered farmland, they found Jakob sitting on the trough, breath steaming in the cold air, rifle across his knees, the silo still smouldering behind him. He barely looked up when the lieutenant approached. He was simply staring at the fields, at the land he had tried so desperately to save. The lieutenant asked him what had happened here. Jakob didn't answer at first. He just nodded toward the courtyard, toward the scattered bodies, toward the ruined headquarters, toward the smoking tower that had become, for 40 unbroken hours, the most unlikely sniper nest in Belgium. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, "I just kept my land, and I kept them from killing yours."